It was a cool and quiet morning in the small town. The sun had just risen, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. Birds were chirping from the trees near the main street, and shopkeepers were slowly opening their stores. The local bank, a tall building with shiny glass doors and a proud sign above it, had already started its daily routine. Customers stood in line, some waiting to deposit money, others there for small loans or to cash their paychecks. Everything seemed normal until the old man arrived. He walked slowly. His back slightly bent from years of hard work, but there was something steady about his steps. In one hand, he carried a worn-out brown sack, its fabric old and faded, with patches sewn here and there. The sack looked heavy, but he held it firmly, as if its contents were precious to him. His clothes were simple: an old jacket with a missing button, pants that looked a little too big for him, and a hat pulled low over his forehead. His shoes were scuffed and dusty, showing the long miles they had walked. At first, no one paid much attention. People in the bank were busy with their own thoughts. But as the old man came closer, a few eyes followed him. There was something different about him, something that made people curious. Maybe it was the way he moved, not in a hurry, not in fear, but with quiet confidence. He pushed open the glass doors, and they made a soft, creaking sound. The sudden shift in light from the bright morning to the dimmer bank interior made his eyes narrow slightly. Inside, the bank's air smelled faintly of paper, ink, and fresh coffee from the counter where the staff kept their mugs. A young receptionist at the desk glanced up, gave him a polite smile, then quickly returned to her paperwork. The old man's eyes slowly scanned the room. He saw the long counter where the teller stood, the waiting chairs in the corner, and the clock ticking softly. Above the manager's office, he noticed how the staff laughed softly among themselves between serving customers, and how people in line tapped their feet impatiently. With his sack in hand, he walked toward the counter. His steps made a soft thud on the tiled floor, and the sound seemed to echo a little. The closer he came, the more people began to notice him. A few whispered to each other, wondering what was inside the sack. Some thought he might be bringing coins to deposit. Others guessed it might be groceries or tools. He stopped in front of the main teller, a young man in a crisp shirt and tie. The teller gave him a quick once-over, clearly not expecting anything unusual. But the old man didn't fumble for a withdrawal slip or count out cash. Instead, he stood straight, adjusted his hat slightly, and took a slow, deep breath. The room wasn't silent, but it felt like the air shifted. Maybe it was the way he looked, calm, yet determined, as though every step he had taken that morning had been leading up to this very moment. The sack hung at his side like a secret he was ready to share, but only when the time was right. A woman in line behind him leaned a little to the side, trying to peek at his face. A man near the entrance crossed his arms, curious to see what would happen next. It wasn't every day that someone like this walked into the bank. There was no rush in his movements, no nervousness in his eyes. He didn't look like a man begging for money or a customer. With a small errand, he looked like a man with a mission. Every person who saw him that morning remembered the small details, the worn fabric of the sack, the way his fingers tightened on its handle, the slow rhythm of his footsteps, the faint smell of dust and leather from his clothes. He seemed out of place in the modern, shiny bank, yet somehow he looked like he belonged there more than anyone else in the room. The teller finally spoke, asking politely, "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" The old man's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed the sack gently on the counter. The weight of it made a soft thump, enough to make the teller's eyebrows raise slightly. Everyone nearby could sense that something unusual was about to happen. There was an unspoken tension in the air, like the first quiet moments before a storm. The old man's eyes, sharp despite his age, met the teller's gaze directly. It was the kind of look that carried history's stories, struggles, and secrets untold. In that moment, no one knew that this man's arrival would change the atmosphere of the entire bank. No one knew that within the next hour, laughter would turn into shock and disbelief into regret. All they saw was an old man with a sack. But for him, this was the moment he had been waiting for, perhaps for years. And while others saw just an ordinary morning, he knew this was the beginning of something that would be remembered for a very long time. Asterisk, asterisk, the young teller waited for the old man to speak. But the pause stretched longer than anyone expected. People in line started shifting their weight, glancing at their watches, and wondering what was taking so long. The old man finally lifted his chin, and in a calm, steady voice, he said something that froze the room. "I own this bank." For a second, there was silence. The words hung in the air like a strange echo that no one knew how to react to. Then, slowly, the sound of laughter began to spread. It started with a chuckle from a man in the corner, then a snicker from a young woman holding her phone, and finally, loud bursts of laughter from two men sitting on the waiting chairs. The teller blinked in confusion, unsure if he had heard correctly. "I'm sorry, sir. Did you mean you want to open an account?" he asked politely, trying to hide a smile. The old man's gaze didn't waver. "No," he replied firmly. "I said I own this bank. Every wall, every chair, every coin inside. It belongs to me." The laughter grew louder. A group of teenagers in line began whispering and pointing at him. "Maybe he thinks he's in a movie," one of them said under their breath. The security guard near the entrance, a big man with folded arms, smirked and shook his head. To them, this was just an eccentric old man making wild claims. The bank manager, a tall woman in a navy blue suit, had been watching from her glass office. She stepped out, curious about the disturbance. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. The teller explained quickly, trying not to laugh. "This gentleman says he owns the bank." The manager gave the old man a polite but doubtful smile. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right place? Maybe you mean you own a bank account here?" The old man placed both hands on the sack in front of him. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it. "No, I own this bank, and I can prove it, eh?" Now, everyone in the bank was paying attention. Customers who had been busy with their transactions leaned sideways to get a better view. Even the receptionist had stopped typing, her eyes fixed on the scene. It was the kind of moment where curiosity pulled people in like a magnet they wanted to see how far this strange claim would go. Someone in the back muttered, "Maybe he's carrying gold in that sack." Another joked, "Yeah, or maybe it's full of magic beans." A burst of laughter followed, but the old man didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the manager. He reached for the knot of the sack and began to untie it slowly, as if every move was deliberate. The fabric made a soft rustling sound as he opened it, and for the first time, the room began to quiet down. He didn't pull anything out yet. Instead, he asked the manager a simple question. "Do you know who built this bank?" She frowned slightly, caught off guard. "I suppose the company's founders did, many decades ago." "That's right," he nodded. "And I was there. Every brick, every beam of wood, I helped put it in place. I was paid in shares, not cash. And I kept every document they gave me." He tapped the sack gently. "It's all in here." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't from disbelief, was from a strange, creeping curiosity. What if he was telling the truth? The manager crossed her arms, still skeptical, but now more cautious. "All right, sir. If you have proof, let's see it." The old man's fingers slipped inside the sack, and the faint sound of paper sliding against paper could be heard. The smell of old parchment and leather wafted into the air, the kind of smell that came from documents older than most of the people in the room. Someone whispered, "What if he's serious?" Another person replied, "Nah, no way. He's just playing." But deep down, a few people in that bank were starting to wonder. The old man's calmness, his confidence, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like the slow beginning of something big, something that would make everyone there remember this day for the rest of their lives. The manager glanced toward the security guard, signaling him to stay alert. She didn't know if this was going to end in trouble or in truth. But one thing was clear, this old man wasn't going anywhere until he had his say. And so, as the sack began to open wider, all eyes in the bank leaned forward, waiting for the next move. The bank felt different now. The air was heavier, as if everyone inside was holding their breath. The old man's sack rested on the counter like a mystery no one could quite figure out. The teller shifted uneasily, while the manager stood close, her eyes fixed on him. Few people in the back had even pulled out their phones, ready to record what they thought might be some kind of bizarre prank. Then, the whispers started. It began with a quiet giggle from the teenage boy in the corner, his hand half covering his mouth. "Is this guy for real?" he whispered to his friend. His friend snorted and shook his head. "Maybe he's about to pull out a genie," he said. And they both laughed. A man in a worn baseball cap leaned toward the woman next to him and said, "I bet that sack's full of old socks." She chuckled, shaking her head. "Or maybe he's got his lunch in there? You know how some old folks are always carrying things around like it's gold?" The sound of laughter began to spread like ripples in water. It wasn't loud at first, just soft, mocking chuckles, but it was enough to make the atmosphere shift. People weren't just curious anymore. They were amused, and not in a kind way. The old man didn't seem to hear them, or maybe he just didn't care. His eyes were locked on the manager, his hands steady on the sack. But the mockery grew bolder. "Hey, maybe he thinks he's a millionaire," one man called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Careful, folks, maybe that's the secret." Treasure of the century. Another customer, a young woman in a bright red coat, laughed and said loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Well, if he owns the bank, maybe he can forgive my mortgage." People around her chuckled. The teller tried to keep a straight face, but the corners of his mouth twitched. "Sir," he said gently, "I think you might be mistaken." "I am not mistaken," the old man interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried a weight that made the teller stop mid-sentence. Still, a few in the crowd couldn't help themselves. The teenage boy cupped his hands and whispered loudly, "Is this a comedy show? Because it's working." More laughter followed. The security guard shifted from one foot to the other, his hand resting on his belt. He wasn't laughing. His eyes were on the old man, but not with humor, more with suspicion. After years on the job, he had learned that the quiet ones were the ones to watch closely. The manager stepped a little closer, her heels clicking on the tiled floor. "Sir, please understand," she began. "This is a busy morning. If you're making a joke," the old man's voice rose, steady but firm. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The room went still for a moment. It wasn't the words, but the way he said them, each syllable, deliberate, carrying the weight of years. His eyes swept over the people in the room, and for a split second, the laughter faded into an uneasy quiet. But the silence didn't last. Someone in the back snickered. Another muttered, "This is crazy," and shook his head. It was clear they didn't believe him. They saw only what their eyes told them, old man in worn clothes with a ragged sack. And in their minds, someone like that couldn't possibly own a bank. The old man seemed to know exactly what they were thinking. He let out a slow breath and said, almost to himself, "You all think you know what wealth looks like." He patted the sack gently. "Oh, but you've never seen what I'm about to show you." The room went quiet again, But this time, it wasn't out of respect, it was because curiosity was fighting against disbelief. The manager gave a small nod toward the security guard, moved a step closer, just in case. No one knew what would happen next. Some still expected him to pull out something ridiculous and prove their laughter right. Others, though, were beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this old man wasn't the fool they thought he was. The old man's fingers moved to the sack again. This time, he didn't open it right away. Instead, he looked up at the crowd, his sharp gaze moving from one mocking face to another. His voice dropped low, but somehow it carried to every corner of the bank. "You're all laughing now," he said quietly, "but you won't be in a moment." And with that, his hand disappeared into the sack. Asterisk, the old man's fingers disappeared into the sack. And for a few seconds, the only sound in the bank was the faint crinkle of old paper and the rustle of fabric. People leaned forward instinctively, their curiosity rising despite themselves. Even those who had been laughing just moments before found their eyes locked on his hands, waiting to see what would emerge. Slowly, deliberately, he drew out a thick bundle wrapped in a faded leather cover. The leather was cracked with age, its corners worn soft from decades of use. A faint smell of dust and history drifted into the air, a scent that didn't belong in a shiny modern bank. "What's that?" someone in the back asked, their voice tinged with a mix of mockery and intrigue. The old man placed the bundle gently on the counter, as if handling something fragile and precious. Then, with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment, he untied the thin leather strap, holding it closed. The strap gave way with a soft snap, revealing a stack of yellowed documents, each one carefully preserved in protective sleeves. The teller's smirk faded a little as he leaned in. The caper looked really old. The ink was slightly faded, but the words were still clear. The handwriting elegant and formal, the kind you only saw in historical archives. The old man glanced up at the manager. "You asked for proof. Here it is." He slid the first document forward. The manager hesitated, then picked it up. Her eyes scanned the heading, and her brow furrowed. She read silently, then flipped to the next page, her expression changing as she went on. "What does it say?" the teller asked, unable to hide his curiosity now. The manager didn't answer right away. She read more carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line. This is a property deed," she finally said, her voice quieter than before. A few customers leaned in closer, murmuring to each other. "Yes," the old man said, his voice firm. "That's the original deed for this land and building. It's dated before this bank even opened its doors. And look closely whose name is on it." The manager's eyes returned to the page, and she read aloud. "Registered to Elijah Thomas." "That's me," the old man said, straightening his back. His voice carried no arrogance, just a calm certainty. A ripple of surprise went through the room. Some of the mocking smiles faded into confusion. A woman near the door whispered, "Wait, is he serious?" The old man reached into the sack again and pulled out more paper-sold contracts, shareholder agreements, and letters with signatures so ornate they looked like art. He laid them out one by one, the pile growing in front of him. Each paper told a piece of the story, that decades ago, when the town was smaller, the land was bought by him with money he had earned through years of work in farming and trading. Instead of selling it outright, he had invested it in the construction of the bank in exchange for a share of its ownership. "I never sold my share," the old man continued. "It's all here, every document, every agreement. The bank may have changed hands, but no one ever bought me out. That means this place is still mine, at least in part." The room was dead silent now. The teenagers who had been laughing earlier stared with wide eyes. The man in the baseball cap scratched his head. The woman in the red coat clutched her handbag tighter, suddenly looking uncomfortable. The manager set the papers down slowly, almost reverently, as if she realized she was holding something valuable, not just in money, but in history. She looked at the old man, then back at the documents, then at the security guard. We need to verify this, she said carefully. But there was no mockery in her tone, no, only caution. The old man gave a small nod, as if he had expected. That? Go ahead, he said. I've waited decades. I can wait a little longer. Something had shifted in the room. The laughter was gone, replaced by a growing sense of unease. People glanced at each other, unsure what to believe. Some were beginning to feel embarrassed for having mocked him. The old man rested his hand on the pile of papers, his fingers spread protectively. You laughed when I walked in, he said softly. You thought an old man with a sack had nothing worth listening to, but you were wrong. The bank was no longer just a place of transactions, it had become a courtroom of sorts, with every witness silently waiting for the truth to be confirmed. And in that moment, it was clear. Whatever came next, things in this bank would never be the same. Asterisk. The manager stood there, still holding the deed in her hands, as if afraid that even the smallest movement might cause the fragile paper to crumble. The bank had never felt so still. Even the faint hum of the ceiling lights seemed louder in the silence. Customers who had been ready to leave were now rooted in place, unwilling to miss what might happen next. The old man Elijah Thomas didn't look nervous. In fact, his calmness was unsettling to those who had been mocking him just minutes earlier. He stood with his hands folded on top of the sack, watching the manager with patient eyes. The way someone watches a long-awaited truth finally begin to surface. The manager cleared her throat and called toward the back. Andrew, can you come here for a moment? A young assistant in a neatly pressed shirt hurried over, his brow furrowed. Yes, ma'am. I need you to make a copy of these documents and send them to the legal department right now, she said, handing over the deed and several other papers from the pile. And contact the county records office. I want to confirm these immediately. Andrew nodded, glancing at Elijah with open curiosity before hurrying toward the back office. For a while, there was nothing to do but wait. People began whispering. Again, but the tone had changed. It wasn't mocking anymore, it was cautious, almost apologetic. Do you think it's real? A woman in a blue dress murmured to her husband. I don't know, he replied, but those papers sure didn't look fake. Near the corner, the teenagers who had been laughing earlier were now staring at the floor, avoiding Elijah's gaze. The man in the baseball cap shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. Elijah stood silent, but his presence filled the room. He wasn't boasting, he wasn't gloating. He was simply waiting, just as he had waited for decades. After several minutes, Andrew returned, holding a phone in one hand and a printed sheet in the other. His expression was a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Ma'am, he said to the manager. The county records office confirmed it. This deed is authentic. It's filed in Mr. Elijah Thomas's name. They even have a scanned copy in there. Archives exactly matching his documents. The room erupted into a low wave of murmurs. Wait, so? He's telling the truth. Someone whispered. Looks like it. Another replied, shaking their head in amazement. But Andrew wasn't finished. There's more, he added. The shareholder agreement. It's still active. It shows that Mr. Thomas never sold his ownership stake. Legally, he still holds a controlling interest in the property and partial ownership of the bank itself. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The woman in the red coat let out a small gasp. The teenagers exchanged wide-eyed glances. The man in the baseball cap muttered something under his breath. A quiet admission of guilt for doubting the old man. The manager turned to Elijah. her professional composure beginning to crack. "Mr. Thomas," she said slowly, "it appears everything you've said is true." Elijah gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I told you," he said softly. In that moment, the balance of the room shifted completely. The people who had been laughing at him now looked at him with something closer to respect or shame. The mockery that had once filled the bank was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The security guard, who had been standing watch, stepped back slightly, his expression changing from suspicion to admiration. One by one, customers began to move aside, giving Elijah space not because he demanded it, but because they felt they owed it to him. The teller, who had tried to hide his smile earlier, now looked down at his desk, avoiding eye contact. Elijah didn't rub it in. He didn't scold anyone. He simply rested his hand on the papers and said, "Sometimes the truth takes time to catch up, but when it does, it can't be denied." The manager gestured toward her office. "Please, Mr. Thomas, would you join me inside so we can discuss this properly?" Elijah nodded, picking up his sack and walking past the stunned crowd. His steps were just as steady as when he had first entered the bank, but now every eye in the room followed him. Not with amusement, but with quiet awe, and as the glass door to the manager's office closed behind him, the whispers began again, not mocking this time, but filled with the hum of realization. They had laughed at him. Now they could only regret. The manager's office door clicked shut behind Elijah, but his presence still lingered in the main lobby like an invisible weight. The room wasn't the same anymore. Just minutes ago, it had been filled with chuckles, smirks, and careless remarks. Now, all of that had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence and the uneasy shifting of feet. The customers who remained avoided meeting each other's eyes. The woman in the red coat, who had joked about having her mortgage forgiven, stood stiffly with her arms crossed, her cheeks faintly pink. The teenagers, once grinning at every sarcastic comment, now fidgeted like schoolchildren who'd been caught making fun of the wrong person. Even the man in the baseball cap kept glancing toward the office door, as if silently willing Elijah to come out so he could say anything that might make up for the laughter earlier. The teller, still at his counter, shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. His hands moved nervously, and the faint flush in his face betrayed the guilt he felt. The security guard remained near the entrance, but his posture had changed. He wasn't watching Elijah anymore. He was watching the crowd, as though daring anyone to make another unkind remark. Inside the office, though the glass was frosted, shapes could be seen moving Elijah's slow, steady silhouette, and the manager leaning over the desk with papers spread before her. Every now and then, a faint murmur escaped, but the words were too muffled to understand. The mystery of what they were discussing only made the people outside more restless. Whispers began to flow again, this time softer, cautious, and tinged with a strange respect. "I can't believe it's true," someone said quietly. "He really does own at least part of it. Imagine carrying proof like that around all these years," another replied. "He must have been waiting for the right moment. But why now?" A man near the door wondered aloud. "Walk in today and tell everyone." No one had the answer. All they knew was that they had witnessed something rare. Reversal of judgment so swift and so undeniable that it left them all unsettled. Minutes ticked by, and the office door finally opened. Elijah stepped out, carrying his sack in one hand and a small envelope in the other. The manager followed, her expression far different from before. The polite doubt had been replaced with a professional respect, almost bordering on deference. She cleared her throat and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I want to clarify something. Mr. Thomas is, in fact, a legal shareholder and part owner of this bank's property. His documents have been verified with county records and our legal department. This is not a mistake. Her words seemed to echo in the lobby. Even people who had already guessed the truth shifted uncomfortably hearing it confirmed out loud. The teenagers dropped their eyes to the floor. The woman in the red coat gave a small, embarrassed nod in Elijah's direction. The man in the baseball cap took off his hat and held it in front of him. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked around the room, his eyes pausing on a few faces that had laughed at him earlier. His gaze wasn't filled with anger, but with something deeper. Something that made those under it feel smaller than they had moments ago. "I didn't come here for applause," he said slowly, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "And I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came here for the truth. The truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be heard." He turned to leave, walking toward the glass doors with the same steady steps he had when he first arrived. But this time, no one dared to chuckle. No one dared to make a joke. Instead, they moved out of his way, creating a clear path as if instinctively honoring him. As he reached the door, he paused and looked over his shoulder. "Remember this," he said quietly. "Wealth isn't always worn on the outside, and respect should never be given only to those who look like they deserve it. It should be given to everyone, because you never know who you're talking to." With that, he pushed the door open and stepped into the sunlight. The bright morning light seemed to embrace him as he walked down the steps, his sack swinging. Gently at his side, inside the bank, the silence lingered. But this time, it wasn't just awkward. It was the silence of reflection, of people replaying the moment in their minds and wishing they had acted differently. The regret had fully set in. The sun was just beginning to dip lower in the sky when Elijah returned to the bank later that week. The air was warmer, carrying the faint scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. But the tension around the bank doors was still sharp. Word had spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By now, almost everyone in town knew the story. People had whispered it in grocery lines, murmured it over coffee at the diner, and shared it in hushed tones at the post office. "Did you hear about the old man who walked into the bank with a sack and claimed he owned it?" they'd say. And then, with wide eyes, they'd add, "He wasn't lying." When Elijah stepped onto the bank's front steps, there was already a small crowd lingering nearby, not to mock him this time, but to watch history unfold. Men tipped their hats. Women offered polite smiles. Children, curious and unsure why everyone treated him so differently now, stared up at him with wide eyes. Inside, the bank looked almost staged for the occasion. The manager stood near the entrance, her navy blue suit pressed crisp, her posture upright but respectful. Beside her, two suited men from the legal department held a briefcase and several folders. The security guard, who had once eyed Elijah with suspicion, now opened the door for him without a word, bowing his head slightly as he passed. Elijah, the manager, greeted softly, as if addressing a man of high standing. "We're ready." "For you?" He stepped forward, his sack still in his hand, not because he needed it today, but because it had become a symbol. That old, patched, worn piece of fabric had carried proof strong enough to change everything. They guided him into the same office where he had sat days before, but now the tone was completely different. The atmosphere carried a mix of formality and humility. The two lawyers laid out documents on the polished desk, their voices calm and professional as they explained each page. "Mr. Thomas." One began, "After thorough review of the historical records and all your legal documents, we have confirmed that your ownership stake in the bank is valid and binding. We also acknowledge your controlling rights over the property as stated in the original agreement." Elijah nodded slightly, as though hearing what he had always known. The second lawyer slid a folder toward him. "This is the updated registry, showing you as the rightful primary shareholder. It is also signed by our board of directors. From this day forward, you are recognized not just in record, but in operation." The manager added, "This means you have full say in how this bank is run, Mr. Thomas, and I would like to personally apologize for doubting you when you walked in that morning." Elijah looked at her, his expression calm. "You doubted me because of what you saw, not what you knew," he said. "Most people do the same. But the truth always finds its way to the surface." He signed the final papers with a slow, steady hand. His signature was neat, deliberate teach stroke, as confident as the man himself. When the last page was done, the lawyers shook his hand respectfully as he stepped out into the main lobby. The crowd inside the bank stood a little taller, as if they were in the presence of someone important. And in truth, they weren't, because he owned a bank now, but because he had proven something greater, that appearances deceive, and dignity has no uniform. Some of the same faces who had laughed at him earlier that week were there again. But this time, they didn't laugh. A few gave small nods of acknowledgement. Others murmured, "Congratulations, Mr. Thomas." The man in the baseball cap finally spoke up, his voice low. "Sir, I was wrong about you. I shouldn't have said what I did." Elijah's eyes met his. "We've all been wrong about someone before," he replied. "What matters is what you do after you find out the truth." And with that, he stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. The light caught on the leather of his sack as it swung by his side, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire street paused to watch him walk by. The bank was his noun, not just in paper, but in respect. The days after Elijah's victory felt different in the small town. News of what had happened didn't just stay in the bank, it spilled into every shop, every home, and every whispered conversation in the streets. People told the story over dinner tables and in late-night phone calls. But no matter how many times it was retold, the ending was always the same. They laughed until they regretted it. For Elijah, the win was never about showing off. It wasn't about revenge or making anyone feel small. It was about something much deeper: justice, truth, and dignity. The papers he had carried for decades had finally spoken for him, and now the town was listening in a way they never had before. A week later, the bank held a small public event to acknowledge the change in ownership. The manager had insisted on it, and while Elijah wasn't fond of attention, he agreed because it wasn't just his story anymore. It was a lesson the whole town needed to hear. Chairs were set up in neat rows outside the bank. Townsfolk filled them quickly, some out of curiosity, others out of respect. The same faces that had once smirked at him now looked at him with quiet admiration. Even those who had avoided him before seemed eager to be in his presence. Elijah stepped up to a small podium, wearing the same old jacket and hat he had worn the day he first walked into the bank. In one hand, he held the sack not because it was needed anymore, but because it had become part of his story, a symbol of the truth he had carried. When he spoke, his voice was steady and warm, carrying easily over the gathered crowd. "I was born not far from here," he began. "I worked these lands, built with my own 2 hands, and saved every penny I could. When I invested in this bank, I wasn't thinking about glory or power, was thinking about the future. About leaving something that would outlive me." He paused, his eyes moving slowly over the crowd. "But years passed, and people forgot. And when they looked at me, an old man with worn clothes, they saw someone with nothing to offer. I saw a joke. That's the way of the world sometimes. People measure your worth by what they can see, not by what you've built, what you've endured, or what you've carried inside." The audience was silent, every ear tuned to his words. "Many of you laughed at me that day," he continued, his voice softer now. "And that's all right. I've lived long enough to know that laughter fades, but truth remains. My story isn't about proving you wrong, Mitz. about reminding you that respect should never be given based on appearances. Give it freely, too. Everyone, because you never know who might be carrying the kind of story that could change everything you believe. There was a long, heavy silence when he finished. It wasn't the awkward silence of guilt anymore. It was the stillness that comes when people know they've just heard something they'll carry with them for the rest of their lives. From the back of the crowd, a small boy raised his hand timidly. "Mr. Thomas," he called out, "what's in the sack now?" Elijah smiled faintly. "The same thing it's always carried," he said. "Proof of who I am." And with that, he stepped away from the podium. The crowd rose to their feet, not just to clap, but to honor him. It wasn't the applause of entertainment. It was the applause of respect. As Elijah walked away from the bank that day, the sunlight caught the edge of his hat, and for a moment, he looked like a figure from another time, someone who had seen the world change, and yet had carried his truth through it all without letting it be stolen in the years to come. The story of the old black man with a sack would become part of the town's history. Parents would tell it to their children, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Never underestimate a person, and never laugh at someone whose story you don't yet know. Because someday, the truth might just walk through your door carrying a sack.